Good evening from Vancouver. I'm Trina McQueen, and welcome to the first English language debate among the major party leaders in this election campaign. And this is your debate. For the next 2 hours, the leaders will answer questions from Canadians just like you, from all across our country. There were nearly 10,000 questions submitted. The network producers from Global, CTV, and CBC have chosen questions that represented the themes in the emails we got, and they recorded those questions for playback tonight. The questions have been organized into 4 themes. The party leaders were given a list of the themes, but not the specific questions. They will see and hear the questions for the very first time tonight. There are time limits on the leaders' answers. 1 minute for the first round, 30 seconds, and then 15 seconds for the follow-ups. And the leaders have promised not to interrupt each other. The party leaders, in fact, know all the rules, and they have agreed that I should enforce them. Before we get to the first questions, each leader will have 1 minute for an opening statement, and the order was determined by a draw. Paul Martin of the Liberal Party will go first. Mr. Martin.
Well, thank you very much. First, I want to thank Trina for agreeing to keep us in line, and I want to thank all of you for watching. In Canada today, our economy is strong. Deficits are history. Unemployment is lower than it has been in 30 years. But this is no time to take anything for granted. It's time to build on what we have accomplished together. I believe in strengthening public health care. That's why I'm working with the provinces to cut wait times. I believe in helping Canadians keep more of what they earn, and that's why I'm cutting taxes. I believe in balanced budgets, a ban on handguns. I believe in high-quality child care and a truly independent foreign policy. And I believe in a united Canada, in what we can achieve together as a nation. Now, my opponents and I will disagree tonight. That's because we don't believe in the same things. We would take Canada down very different paths. That's why it matters who you choose to lead our nation and what that person believes. Thank you.
Mr. Gilles Duceppe of the Bloc Québécois.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Because of the Liberal sponsorship scandal, Paul Martin's government has lost the moral authority to govern. The Liberal Party has tried to buy Quebecers with taxpayers' money. The Liberals still try to fool the people by pretending that this election is a referendum. Of course, the Bloc Québécois is a sovereigntist and progressive party that respects Canada. But it is a federal election, and the sponsorship scandal is at the center of it. Judge Garmery concluded that the Liberal Party dishonors itself, that undemocratic behavior infuriated Quebecers of all origins. On January 23rd, it will be up to you to sanction the Liberals. For too long, the Liberals have taken the vote of Quebec's cultural communities for granted. This era is over. Thank you.
Mr. Jack Layton of the New Democratic Party.
Good evening. The NDP is about getting results for people. You saw the difference we made in the last Parliament, and there's more to do. We're working for education and training for our young people so that they're ready for that 21st century economy and so that Canada can be strong. We've got to fix the health system and stop the privatization. And to get a long-term care plan in place for seniors, as well as doing something about drug costs. And finally, we've got to clean up the terrible Liberal corruption scandal. Let's adopt Ed Broadbent's plan and clean up politics and make sure that everyone who's elected is accountable. It's a different way of doing politics, a real change. It's very different from the political games and the vote-buying promises you'll hear tonight from the Liberals and the Conservatives. Getting results for people. When you elect an NDP MP, you'll be sending a voice for change to Ottawa. I think it's time. Thank you.
Mr. Stephen Harper from the Conservative Party.
Thank you. Tonight I want to spend my time talking to you about the direction a Conservative government will take this country. Canada needs a new government to bring accountability to Ottawa, to get on with addressing the real concerns of ordinary working people and their families. A Conservative government will clean up politics in Ottawa, cut taxes, starting with the GST, crack down on crime, bring in a patient guarantee for wait times in health care, support parents directly with the costs of childcare, assist students, workers, small businesses, seniors, and rebuild our armed forces. After 12 years of scandal and inaction, Only a new government can turn the page and address the real priorities that you have. You, the ordinary people who work hard, pay your taxes, and play by the rules. During the debate this evening, I would ask you to keep one question in mind. Which party can bring real change to Ottawa, establish accountable government, and take real action on your priorities?
Thank you all for your opening statements. And our first question tonight comes from Pat White from Ottawa on the theme of social policy. And we're going to ask Mr. Harper to respond to that first.
My name is Pat White in Ottawa, Ontario. My daughter Beth is in law school at Queen's University. She's planning on practicing law and raising her family in Canada. Do you think she and her partner Susie should have the same rights as heterosexual couples? If not, how would your party justify discriminating against a Canadian for an aspect of their identity that is comparable to race, sex, or religion, and even consider using the notwithstanding clause?
Well, thank you very much. Obviously, the issue of marriage, the definition of marriage, is an emotional and contentious issue. Most Conservatives support the traditional definition of marriage. Our party position is to support the traditional definition while supporting similar rights and benefits for all other equivalent relationships. Our government will not use the notwithstanding clause. After this election, in which Canadians will debate this issue, we'll simply hold a free vote in Parliament. Even if Parliament adopts to proceed with traditional definition of marriage, we will make sure that all existing marriages, all existing same-sex marriages, must be protected in law. This is a controversial and difficult issue, but I believe this is the democratic way to deal with those differences. And I say once again, our party will allow a free vote of all elected members of Parliament.
Thank you. Mr. Martin.
We are a nation of minorities. And what that means is that all minorities must protect each other. And it is the responsibility of the Prime Minister to defend the Charter of Rights. And the Prime Minister cannot cherry-pick among rights that he happens to like or ones that he doesn't happen to like. He must defend all rights. And the problem is that Mr. Harper's position simply is not sustainable. Mr. Harper wants to reopen the issue, the charter issue of same-sex marriage, and he would take away a charter right. Now, to do that, you have to use the notwithstanding clause. Now, that's not just what I say. There are 134 constitutional scholars who have come out and said there is no other alternative. And I believe it's wrong to take away people's rights. I believe the job of the Prime Minister is to protect them, not just the ones you happen to agree with. Mr. Harper has two incompatible positions. His position is not sustainable, and his integrity demands that he tell Canadians, in fact, what his true policies and agenda are.
Mr. Layton.
Well, Pat, first of all, I can feel the pride in your voice as you speak about your daughter and your hopes for her in the future. And I'm very proud that the NDP was able to stand strongly in the House and has done so for so many years, with many of our members of Parliament speaking out over the years for rights for lesbians and gays and for their relationships. But it's sad to see what's happening here right now. We have the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party playing politics, driving wedges between Canadians on something that has already been resolved, on a fundamental issue of human rights. And it's a sad time to hear this kind of debate going on. There's one thing you can do to make sure that such an issue doesn't get raised again and debated and undone in the House of Commons, and that's to send more New Democratic Party members of Parliament to the House. We will stand strong and firm for the full equality that we're talking about here tonight. Let's not play any more politics with it.
Mr. Duceppe.
Yes, we should not revisit that question. I think that was decided. And we have to understand that the religion of some shouldn't constitute the law for everyone, for everybody. We have to respect each individual. And I think that the gays and lesbians have the same right now on in our society. And a society is not really free when someone is not free. I fought very hard on that question, and the Bloc strongly supported the law proposed by the Liberal government. And we didn't start fighting for that in the last months. We did it well before. And I remember, I think I signed one of the first collective agreements ever in 1986, recognizing the right for same-sex couple to have the same right in a collective agreement concerning insurance and so on. So it is deeply within Quebec society and now in the Canadian society, and I think it's a great plus for our society.
Well, three of you think that this question has been and should be settled, and one of you doesn't. The question is, what's wrong with having a free vote, and how will that issue be decided if there is a free vote on the issue? Mr. Duceppe.
Well, we already had a free vote on that. So I think we shouldn't have a free vote on a question that was resolved every 6 months. That was decided, and I think we have to live with that. And people, I think, will get used to that because it is now normal. And I don't want to live in a society when some people don't have the same kind of rights than other people.
Mr. Martin.
Well, the essence of the Charter of Rights is, in fact, to protect minorities against a majority which may want to take away those rights. That's why we have a charter. That's the purpose of the Supreme Court, and it's on all of the high courts across the country. Now, let's assume, for the sake of discussion, that the vote was held and it went the other way. Then what you'd end up having to do is challenge the charter right of same-sex marriage, and you'd have to use the notwithstanding clause. And Mr. Harper says he won't use it. It's incompatible. It's not sustainable.
What do you think, Mr. Layton?
Well, I think it's very important for a political party to stand absolutely firmly behind the concept of human rights for all minorities, and in particular for lesbians and gays that we're talking about here right now. I wish the Prime Minister would make a commitment that his party, or members of his party who might be elected, because many of them voted against this right in the last Parliament, will not bring this forward. And I would urge Mr. Harper to do the same. It doesn't make sense to reopen these questions and start to take steps backwards. It would be so unfair.
Mr. Harper.
An election is a time for people to have their say. This issue was referred to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court left the definition of marriage to Parliament. Mr. Martin and I have a disagreement on a legal opinion. He believes it's a charter issue. I believe it's simply an issue of the definition of marriage. But the real contradiction here is the question Mr. Martin has to answer. If he believes it's a charter issue, why are there dozens of Liberal candidates running in this election who actually support the Conservative position on the issue?
I guess for a final question, one of the things that many people talked about in their emails to us was their concern about the interpretation of the Charter and whether it should be Parliament who expands rights or whether it should be the Supreme Court in its interpretation of the Charter. Mr. Layton, could you take that on?
Well, of course, it should be the feeling and the view of Canadians that sets this forward, and I think we have it. I think Canadians have now accepted that we've moved on, and I see this when they come forward and the couples show me their rings. And I tell you, this is an important achievement that we've made in Parliament.
Mr. Harper.
Well, I believe that Parliament should make laws. Parliament's democratically elected, and the court should interpret them. I don't agree with Mr. Martin's interpretation of the Charter here. I think it's for the courts to interpret the Charter. I think in the meantime, we're obligated to take our democratic positions on these issues.
Mr. Duceppe.
I think it's up to the Parliament, to the elected members, those representing the population to decide, and we decided. So the decision is taken. We don't have to come back on that. We have, I think, to adopt all the laws and make sure those people really have the same rights in practice.
Thank you. Mr. Martin?
The Supreme Court may well interpret as they have in this case, but Mr. Harper, let me tell you, it is the responsibility of the Prime Minister to defend the Charter of Rights. And if you can't defend the Charter of Rights, then you've got to ask why you want to be Prime Minister. I will defend the Charter of Rights, and I will not bring forth new legislation.
Thank you. Our next question is for you, Mr. Martin, from Gary Leslie of Estevan, Saskatchewan, still on social policy.
My name is Gary Leslie from Estevan, Saskatchewan. Given the gun violence occurring in Toronto, will you admit that the gun control bill C-68 has failed miserably in its attempt to control who has possession of illegal firearms? I believe more emphasis should be put on crime control, not gun control. The two are mutually exclusive. What specific change would you make to the gun control bill?
I have already said that we are going to bring in a handgun bill. The fact is, what we've got to do is to choke off the supply of handguns that young Canadians are using to kill each other. And the way you do that in two ways. Number one, much tighter controls at the border, much better intelligence on the one hand, and at the same time, what you've got to do is to stop guns from being stolen and used. The Mayor of Toronto has given as an example. One gun collector had 30 guns stolen. They were used in 12 crimes, and one of those crimes was a murder. So we will bring in a very, very tough banning of the handguns on the one hand. We'll also create a special squad of 250 RCMP officers who will go into communities and help people, help police authorities deal with this issue. But we will also work with the communities. It's very important that we give young people hope so that, in fact, they don't fill that void with violence. That is the fundamental issue. We'll ban handguns and we'll give young people hope.
Mr. Duceppe.
I think we have to have a tougher control of the borders. So I just don't understand why the Liberals closed the 9 RCMP offices at the border. It seems contradictory for me. I think also we have to have a better definition of a certain kind of arms. We've seen things in Quebec recently that people bought the same kind of arms Mark Layton had because the definition is not strict enough. So we have to work on that, and that doesn't even take a vote in Parliament. It takes only a decision from the government. And I think before the end of that campaign, Mr. Martin should take the decision of better defining a certain kind of arms. And finally, one thing I just can't accept is the mismanagement that happened with the gun register. It was supposed to cost $2 million. Well, it seems it will cost something like $2 billion. I just can't understand that. It's another scandal. I'm pretty sure Madam Sheila Fraser will give a very severe report next February on that matter.
Thank you. Mr. Harper?
Thank you very much. We've had an effective handgun ban in this country for years. Mr. Martin has suggested nothing new in this campaign. In fact, we had a low-cost handgun registry that's been in existence for 70 years before this Liberal Party came to power. Liberal Party has introduced a long gun registry at the cost of close to $2 billion. That is not effective in controlling crime, and we will not continue with that program. We will take those monies and put those directly into law enforcement. That's what's missing in this country. This is the first government in the history of our country that has been unable to control handgun violence, unable to control the use of illegal firearms. The solution to this is not simply more gun laws, but to start enforcing the laws in place and to provide mandatory prison sentences for the use of illegal guns in crime, something we have long demanded and something this government has long resisted.
Thank you. Mr. Layton.
Well, handguns have no place in cities. And I guess the question that most of us are asking is, why hasn't there been action on this? We're hearing about it now at election time, but this is not a new problem. In fact, the Auditor General has pointed out that the RCMP hasn't had adequate resources for quite some time. No action by the government. Mr. Duceppe is right in pointing out that border crossings that the RCMP was responsible for have been eliminated. That's exactly opposite what the Prime Minister is currently promising right now. So I guess there's a question of credibility here. Are the Liberals really going to deliver, or are they just going to talk once again? Because that's what we've seen. Similarly, on the issue of supporting those communities where the gangs and the violence tends to be concentrated because they're vulnerable, the people there are vulnerable, they're being preyed upon. Well, we've seen enormous cutbacks in the support to these communities under the tenure of Mr. Martin. And that is what has left these communities struggling. When you meet and talk with them, they want help. The NDP is there to make sure they get it.
Well, we're talking about guns because we're worried about crime, and we had an email from a corrections officer, a parole officer, who said that his experience had led him to believe that the root cause of crime is poverty. Mr. Martin, what do you think about that observation?
I think that that is certainly one of the main causes. It is the hopelessness that poverty causes, but it's also exclusion. It's also the feeling that I'm not part of society and I don't have an opportunity. I had a tremendous conversation the other day in Toronto with 2 young men, and that's what they were talking about, is that I am excluded. I may be poor, I will be poor forever. I don't have a chance to reach up. And we've got to deal with this, and that's why we put in place a major community program to help people deal with this whole issue. We'll continue doing it that way.
Thank you. Mr. Duceppe, on poverty?
I would say nothing justifies using guns, but certainly the roots of those problems, you find them in poverty a lot of time, most of the time. And this is why I just can't accept what the Liberals did. They took $48 billion out of the unemployed people from the unemployment insurance. I mean, $48 billion, it means 48,000 times $1 million. It's a lot of money for the people who needed that money the most. So when they're talking about poor children, it's because they're poor parents also.
Mr. Harper?
I have no doubt that poverty and various other social ills are responsible for some of the crime that we see in some kind of ultimate sense. I believe a Conservative government will have some policies to deal with prevention of crime, particularly to deal with at-risk youth. But that said, we can't blind the fact that the need to deal with prevention of crime can't blind us to the fact we need to be tough on crime. When there are serious crimes, people need to do serious time. I don't think it's a coincidence. We see the rise in crime at the same time as we see falling rates of incarceration for those convicted of those crimes.
Thank you. Mr. Layton, on poverty and crime.
Well, it's interesting to hear this observation that you mentioned is from a correctional officer, someone who works in the correctional system and sees firsthand what is going on. And the comment that I think is very wise, that when we have greater poverty, we're likely to see greater crime. It just makes sense. I think it passes that test. The problem is we've seen poverty grow in our country during the administration of Paul Martin and the Liberals. And that has caused great grief for individuals and has also made these communities very vulnerable.
Okay, let's go to another question, and we'll ask Amy Hall from Calgary to ask that question, and Mr. Layton will start you off with the answer to Amy.
Hello, my name is Amy Hall, and I'm an RN on the Cardiac Intensive Care Unit at the Foothills Medical Centre in Calgary. Canadians have been hearing a lot of promises from politicians these days. Vows of more money for healthcare, more doctors and nurses, and shorter wait times. All of these promises are quite vague. I would like to hear what specific measures you are planning to implement in order to make our healthcare system a more effective and successful one.
Thank you very much. First, we are going to prevent the growth of privatization of healthcare and for-profit healthcare delivery in our country, so that the bill for your health services doesn't come to your home, as it is increasingly doing, or to your employer, but goes to all of us through the government. And Mr. Martin has allowed the growth of private health care to flourish in this country, and it's a shame. Secondly, we will train more nurses and doctors and make sure that the immigrants who come here trained in the health professions are able to get out there and do that work and make that contribution instead of having to drive taxis. We will also make sure that there's a long-term care program and home care program for seniors and those who need it. That way the beds aren't occupied by them. They're getting better care at home. And finally, reduce the price of pharmaceuticals, something the Liberals have promised in 3 elections. They've done nothing about. The New Democrats will make sure that this actually happens.
Mr. Harper, on specifics.
I wish I could tell Amy and all those people who are in healthcare lineups that there is some kind of quick fix for a generation. We now know that there isn't. What we do know is that healthcare lineups have gotten so serious in this country that the Supreme Court of Canada has ruled that they're a violation of our fundamental rights to the security of the person. This is a very serious ruling. Every government in this country says it's committed to the Canada Health Act, as does every party. The courts are now telling us that when we say we're going to provide essential medical service, we have to be able to provide it within a clinically acceptable wait time. What we'll do is we're going to work with the provinces to institute a patient wait times guarantee. It will provide people with the right to receive health care. If they don't receive it, health care that they're guaranteed, they're going to have the right to get it outside their region or even their jurisdiction. This is not an easy thing to do, but quite frankly, if we're going to respect both the Canada Health Act and the Charter of Rights, we have to take a determined effort and do it.
Mr. Duceppe.
Yeah, the provinces face huge challenges when the Liberal government started to cut the payment transfer back in 1994. This is the first cause of what happened after that. And we call that the fiscal imbalance. But also, I want to inform people that in Ottawa, there are 10,000 civil servants working in the health department. And that department don't administer a single hospital. They're there, I think, to check what the provinces are doing. They have no expertise in the health sector. 4,500 of them are promoting health programs. A few years ago, they were 506. I think what we need are not promoters, are not inspectors. We need doctors, and we need the money to come back in the provinces to make sure people will be well served.
Thank you. Mr. Martin.
First thing we have to do is to make sure that the patient is at the center of our healthcare system. And what that means is that we've got to protect our universally, publicly funded healthcare system. When we met with the provinces and put the $41 billion into the system, what we did was to say we're going to fund home care. We're going to fund the provision of new doctors and nurses and health professionals. And we want to deal with a national pharmaceuticals plan. But what is very exciting is we also said we want to deal with a national wait time strategy. We want to establish benchmarks so that they'll come down. And this week, the federal government and the provinces met, and we announced, in fact, not only these benchmarks, but substantial decreases already in wait times. And that is very, very important, because if you can measure what's happening in the healthcare system, if you can measure accessibility, then what you're doing is you're saying the publicly funded healthcare system is working. And that is really our goal, to make sure that it's accessible for anybody who needs care, not just those who have money.
Amy Hall wanted specifics, so let's try to give her some on one issue that we heard a lot about in the emails, and that's the difficulty of finding a doctor. Mr. Harper, can you give Amy some specifics on that?
Well, I think all we can say on that is that after wait times, the second highest priority we're going to have in terms of funding and rebuilding our healthcare system is making sure we graduate more physicians. It was a decision of a lot of governments in this country to cut enrollment in medical schools several years ago. We're now living with the consequences of that decision. That's going to have to be a very high priority. There's, I think, something like 1.3 million Canadians don't have a family doctor. The record is this. Wait times have doubled under this government. That is the record of the Liberal government, the record they deserve to be judged on.
Mr. Layton.
5 million Canadians don't have access to their own family doctor. How are you supposed to get started with your health care needs if you haven't got access to the basic advice and services? This is an enormous failure. Now, the question we have to ask is how can we fix that? Well, we have a choice here. We can either put as a top priority a great big corporate tax cut. That's the top priority for Mr. Martin, $10 billion. Or we can invest in those people that can provide the services we need.
Mr. Martin.
There's no doubt that we have to open up the spaces in our medical schools, but at the same time, there is a huge blockage in terms of residencies in our hospitals, and we've got to fund those residencies. We've got to make them available for Canadian trained medical students on the one hand. We've also got to make sure that, in fact, when foreign doctors come in here, we can recognize their credentials more quickly, and that means upgrading. But fundamentally, we need more doctors and nurses, and we need them right across the country, big cities and in very small towns.
Mr. Duceppe.
It's not up to the federal government to come with specific. It's not their business. The provinces has the expertise, not Ottawa. Ottawa caused the problem 12 years ago, and now the Liberals want to appear like the savior. I mean, we saw them acting like that in so many departments where they're not supposed to be involved. I think that we have to put an end to that mentality of Ottawa knows best, just like that TV program in the 50s, Father Knows Best. We're always facing that mentality of Ottawa intervening in jurisdictions that are theirs.
Our next question is actually for you, Mr. Duceppe, and for all the other leaders, from Iraj Sultani, who wants to ask a question about immigration.
Hi, my name is Iraj Sultani. I'm a new Canadian living in Toronto. My question is addressed to all 4 political leaders. What is your plan to stop discrimination against new highly educated immigrants who come to this great country for opportunities, but they are forced to restart their studies from the very beginning? I would suggest to do something before these people leave for other countries. Thank you.
Well, I consider this is a real problem. But we have also to consider that, again, that matter is a provincial matter. At least in Quebec, it is decided. Education is a provincial responsibilities. Having said that, I think that we have to work as politicians to talking with people in the provinces and in Quebec, and this is what I'm doing, to make sure the rules should be changed, and the corporations also, the doctor colleges and the engineers corp and things like that, have to modify, I think, their rule to make sure that we don't lose those people, because it's a plus. When we're looking for doctors, and I see someone who's a doctor driving a taxi, and I don't have anything against driving a taxi, but that person could do something else. We have to get better prepared to receive those people.
Thank you. Mr. Layton.
Well, here's a case where you have a very clear choice between getting something done or the record. The record is that for the last number of years, under the Liberals, immigrants have not been well served. In fact, they've been told when they come to Canada on the forms that are filled out that we want their professional background, that we value it, and that's why we're having them come to Canada and welcoming them. Then they get here and they find out that their hopes and dreams are dashed, that the doors are closed, that they can't use their professional skills. And what has happened to cause this total unfairness, almost a false advertising to take place? It is because there's been enormous cuts to the immigrant settlement programs, the programs that would help people get that start, the training, the certification, and at election time we always hear the Liberals come out with promises, but the fact is they've failed on this issue. They used to be the party of the immigrants, not anymore.
Well, Mr. Martin?
Well, my colleagues, I guess, are just simply not aware as to what is happening. The fact is the government has put in place a program called Bridge to Work, and it really has three components. The first is, in fact, human resources, health, engineers, apprentices, skills. And it's very interesting, Mr. Duceppe, but the fact is that many of the medical associations are saying that what we need for foreign credentials are in fact pan-Canadian credentials. And I think that there's an enormous amount to be said, and we can work with provinces, we can work with the medical profession. The second area that we've got to recognize is that so many people ask, especially in cases of engineers, for Canadian experience. And I believe the government has a responsibility and a role to play providing people with experience, or to providing small and medium-sized companies with tax credits so that in fact they'll hire people and give them not just experience in their profession, but in fact experience in Canadian experience. And the third is language training, and we've set aside $20 million to do that, and that's very important in dealing with this particular issue.
Mr. Harper.
In the last year, I asked a number of our MPs, led by Diana Blonsey, our immigration critic, to do a comprehensive consultation with new Canadian groups across this country. And the question Mr. Sultani raised is the single biggest problem in the immigration system. People who come to this country with something to contribute and find that they cannot contribute those skills once we get here. It's not good enough to say that this is a provincial matter. We're going to set up, as our first priority in the immigration field, a Canadian agency for the assessment and recognition of credentials. We're going to provide pre-assessment to immigrants who want to come to this country on how they can best use or acquire Canadian credentials, and also make sure the private sector's more aware of those credentials. We want to work aggressively with provinces and with professional associations to facilitate the use of immigrant credentials in this country. This story is a loss of tremendous potential, not just for the dreams of individual immigrants, but for the Canadian economy as a whole. And after 12 years, we should not be this far away from fixing the problem.
Well, you all seem to have interesting ideas on that one. Let's turn to our second theme now, which is a big one, ethics and governance. And we have a question from Nazmin Adatia in Mississauga, and she wants to direct this question specifically to you, Mr. Martin. So let's hear what she has to say.
My name is Nazmin Adatia in Mississauga, Ontario. My family and I live modestly and pay our fair share of taxes. As salaried people, we have very limited means to reduce our tax obligations. Yet we have witnessed $100 million of our taxpayers' money squandered by the Liberal government, as confirmed by the Gomery inquiry. Yet nobody has been held accountable to date. Mr. Martin, as head of the Liberal Party, why should you personally and your party not be held accountable?
Well, the fact is that we are accountable, and that's why I put in place the Gomery Commission. And Mr. Justice Gomery has heard 172 witnesses. He's 25,000 pages worth of testimony. He is an expert. And what he did when he came forth with his report, I immediately turned it over to the RCMP. He named names. And essentially, we've turned that over to the RCMP for their discretion. At the same time, we have undertaken a number of lawsuits against people to recover the money that was stolen. Let me say to you, in terms of dealing with this kind of issue, what you have to do is deal with it frontally. And I did not hesitate for 1 minute to simply say, I'm going to name a commission of inquiry because I want the answers, and I am going to pursue those people who engage in that kind of activity precisely so that you will understand that if integrity is breached in government, the people who did it are going to pay for it. And we've made sure that that is going to happen. I can assure you of that.
Mr. Duceppe.
In the following hours of the publication of the Gomery report, Mr. Martin went public and he took a certain number of decisions, like expulsing 10 people from the Liberal Party, among them Marc-Yvan Côté and Michel Béliveau, well-known organizer of the Liberal Party, and they reimbursed $300,000 of dirty money. They expulsed those two people because they gave dirty money to Liberal candidates and Liberal organizers in the 1997 federal election. I asked yesterday, Mr. Martin, to give the names of those who received that money, because if it was illegal to give that money, it was as illegal to receive that money. I asked in the French debate Mr. Martin to answer that question. He didn't. I asked him again tonight to give the names so the population could know before the election who received that money illegally. I think it's a question of honor for him to give us the name of those who received that money.
Mr. Harper, on accountability.
Thank you. Nassim raises the question, and the answer is obvious. The only way to make sure a government is held accountable is to defeat it, particularly when it's been caught, a governing party with this kind of corruption. And I don't think you're going to see anybody go to jail until there is a new government in office. But I think we need more than a new government, which is why I've said that my first act as Prime Minister will be to bring forward the Federal Accountability Act. We're going to introduce sweeping changes in the way Ottawa is governed to make sure these kinds of scandals never happen again, and that if they do, they're severely punished. We're going to limit donations to federal political parties to $1,000 only from individuals, no more corporate or union contributions. We're going to give the independent officers of Parliament, the Ethics Commissioner, the Information Commissioner, the Auditor General, all the power they have asked for to hold our government accountable. And when there is unethical behavior, we're going to protect whistleblowers. People like Alan Cutler, our candidate in Ottawa South, who was run out of the government when he blew the whistle on Chuck Guite. These people will be protected and rewarded.
Mr. Layton.
Well, I have to say it's with a certain sadness that we're facing this particular question, because many Canadians now have lost faith in the democratic process. I think this is one of the serious consequences of the Liberal scandal, and it's hurt this country badly. We've all got to take some responsibility here and turn this thing around. Now, there is a real choice. People can send a strong message for change to Ottawa in this election. I recommend that you send more New Democrat MPs, because then you know that you'll have people that are working for people first. And we will take Ed Broadbent's plan for ethical and democratic reform, with proportional representation, with removing the lobbyists that make their way right inside the government right now and have too much power. And of course, they produce this tendency towards corporate income tax giveaways that Mr. Martin keeps bringing back to the table. You mentioned you struggle to pay your taxes. It's interesting how quickly the tax giveaways go to the most powerful and the well-connected of the Liberals. Let's not let it happen again.
Well, Mr. Layton, you talk about the damage this has done to politics and perhaps even to democracy, and that's certainly a theme that we heard in our emails, that all politicians are crooks. You are four honest men who have devoted your life to public service. How do you react to this notion that all politicians are the same, crooks?
Well, first, we have a job to do now because of the damage that's been done by this scandal. And it is to restore the trust of the Canadian people. And we've got to do that by getting serious about changing the way things are done. That means democratic reform, ethical reform, so when you're elected, you're held accountable for your actions and your scandals. And that's what New Democrats will ensure.
Mr. Duceppe.
Well, when I go around in Quebec, people are always coming to me and telling me, luckily, you were there in Ottawa to make sure we knew what happened. We've asked 441 questions. Very first questions, when we were asking them, the Liberals were saying it's pure fantasy. The Bloc's inventing things. Says not true. The rules were respected. Those were the kind of answers we were receiving. And finally, we know now that we were right, that we knew what happened. And luckily, the Bloc was there to make a light on that scandal.
Mr. Martin.
You asked a very specific question, and I've got to say that it is one that bothers me enormously. I grew up in a political family. I am very proud of my father. I am very proud of Medicare and all of the things for which he is responsible. And to think that politicians are given the kind of reputations they have today bothers me very much. And that's why I put Judge Gomery in place. That's why I created the commission. I was not going to hide this. I wanted it out, I wanted the answers, and I wanted Canadians to know that, in fact, that openness and transparency and honesty is what pays off.
Mr. Harper, your thoughts on the image of politicians?
Well, I must admit that I hear that and it troubles me. This scandal is without parallel at the federal level in Canadian history. Taxpayers' money was stolen and used for partisan purposes in a way that has done and continues to do enormous damage to the image of Canada in the province of Quebec. I do not believe we can let that go unpunished. The Liberal Party must be held politically accountable for it. At the same time, I've said I'm prepared to bring in any reform. Take a look at the Federal Accountability Act, whether it's cleaning up government appointments or polling, anything necessary to put an end to this.
Thank you. Our second question on ethics and government is from Margaret Benlisset in Richmond, British Columbia, and we'll start with Mr. Duceppe.
Hi, my name is Margaret Benlisset. I'm from Richmond, British Columbia. Out of the dozens of questions that I would like to ask, I have chosen this one. What will you and your party do to stop the current trend of MPs hopping crazily from one party to the next in obvious pursuit of their own ambitions and with total disregard for the voters who elected them in the first place?
Well, Madam, I think it's a good question, but our system, the British parliamentary tradition works like that. And I would say that most of the time, when those people are facing the opinion of the public in an election, they rarely have a success. Unless they quit a party for very political reasons. When the Liberal members and the Progressists, the Conservative members with Lucien Bouchard in 1990 quit the Conservative Party, most of them, and two of them the Liberal Party. Those people did it because they believe in something. And they were judged after that, and the population elected 54 members of the bloc in 1993. So they were right to do that. But when someone is doing it only for, I would say, personal ambition, then people are not fooled, and those people are not winning the next election.
Okay, Mr. Layton on hopping.
The NDP is opposed to this kind of hopping back and forth across the House. You know, it really does engineer a sense of cynicism. Somebody runs with a certain party, a certain platform, and then suddenly they find there's something attractive on the other side, and they're a member of the other party. That's wrong. That's why we have put forward legislation in the House in order to stop this kind of practice from taking place. I wish the other parties would be thoroughly and enthusiastically supporting it, because it would put in place a real accountability. Now, it's not to say a member of Parliament couldn't leave a party and sit as an independent if something is distasteful, but to sit with another party or to take a cabinet position, surely they should have to go back to their electorate. The next time Belinda Stronach wants to cross the floor, she should have to go back to her voters first, and that should apply to all members of Parliament. It has to do with integrity and how you present yourself in an election to people and what you're going to do. That's why Ed Broadbent has made it part of our ethics package. Elect New Democrats will make that law.
Mr. Martin.
Well, the reason that we have increased substantially the number of free votes is the recognition that members of Parliament must have, in most cases, the opportunity to vote their conscience. We elect them for the judgment that they will bring. Well, it's only logical, if that's going to happen, that in fact, as Mr. Duceppe has said, that people must be able, if in fact they find the party that they originally ran or no longer represents their views, as was the case with Belinda Stronach, when the Conservative Party simply did not reflect the views that she felt it should, and a lot of progressive Conservatives feel exactly the same way, she changed. But I would like to just go back, if I might, and ask Mr. Harper a question on his earlier thing. He talked about reform. I guess the question is, are you still going to say that third-party advertising is allowed to basically baffle the restriction on corporate donations? Are you going to reveal the people who donated to your leadership campaign? Those are also reform issues, and I think you have a responsibility, Mr. Harper, to address them.
But your first responsibility, Mr. Harper, is to answer Margaret's question.
Yes, and I will answer Margaret's question, because obviously I completely sympathize with Margaret's question. I understand the frustration, and probably no one feels it as much as me, who saw this spring a determined attempt to lure various MPs from our party with various offers of cabinet positions, ambassadorships, frankly outright bribes. Some of them succeeded, some of them did not succeed. And nobody's more frustrated at it than I am. We've taken a look at a number of private members' bills that would try and stop this kind of thing. I have to be honest to Margaret to say I'm not yet satisfied I've seen one that will work. The problem with all of them is they have the they have the potential effect of giving the party leaders too much control over their MPs and quite frankly, forcing them to vote with the party or driving them out of the party. So I still see problems with that. I wish we had an easy way to deal with it. Get to know your candidates, get some sense of who they are and where they stand, whether they have integrity. I find it funny that Mr. Martin wants to ban private advertising when his government stole public advertising money for partisan purposes.
Thank you very much. And let's get to a second question on accountability from Murray Mills of Pugwash, Nova Scotia, and we'll ask Mr. Harper to lead off on Mr. Mills' question.
My name is Murray Mills, and I live in Pugwash, Nova Scotia. My question is as follows. In an effort to instill honesty, credibility, and accountability in election campaigning, would you be willing to pass and then enforce legislation guaranteeing, firstly, that an election promise made must carry with it a strict but realistic implementation time frame, and secondly, that any promise that is not honored within the time frame mentioned, the member having made that promise must resign his or her seat? Thank you.
I appreciate that question from Murray. In our platform, we've tried to cost out very carefully the things we'll do, and most of the major promises, we promise to do them immediately, so the voters will be able to judge us on that. I know there's some attraction to the idea of having laws that will deal with this kind of thing. I made some reference to this in the French debate last night. Several years ago, I was involved with an effort here in British Columbia to hold responsible a government which had run on a fraudulent budget. There was actually a section in the BC Elections Act. We took the government to court. We fought for years trying to overturn the election, trying to have that government held accountable for that. Ultimately, the court process didn't work, and frankly, it left me with the feeling that this kind of process, no matter what the attraction for it, will inevitably just bog us down in the courts. I think in the end it's up to the voters to evaluate the promises of the parties, decide whether they can believe, and hold people accountable who don't live up to those promises.
Mr. Martin?
Well, Mr. Mills, you raised two very important points. Certainly, I believe that the electorate ought to punish parties which do not keep their promises, which was your second point. Whether, in fact, it can be enshrined in law, I think I do agree with the others that that's pretty difficult to do. Your first point, I believe, however, is something that one can do. I think that time frames should be set out. Because I think that you've got to be able to measure success, and if you can't set out time frames, then I think that fundamentally you've got to wonder about the validity of the promise. As an example, in the last election, we said we would deal with the wait times. I said that I would call a federal provincial conference. I did it within 2 months of the last election. I said the benchmarks would be out before the end of this year. They came out, as I mentioned to you, this week. So I do believe that, in fact, the seriousness of many of commitments made by government ought to be set out by time frames wherever that's possible. It may not be always possible, but I think that your suggestion, Mr. Mills, is one that ought to be examined, and in fact, carried into effect in most cases.
Mr. Layton.
Well, thank you for the question, Murray. You know, it's I have to say I agree with Mr. Martin, except the problem is that he has been breaking promises for so long that he doesn't even recognize it anymore, I guess. And as he's pointing fingers at other people, he should look that 4 of those fingers are pointed, 3 of them are right back at him. What are the promises that he's broken? To reduce pollution. It's up by 24%, despite timetables and promises. To international aid, so that Canada would be a leader. Broke that promise. Bono is no longer supporting the Prime Minister's initiative, and neither are Canadians. Lots of other promises broken. Childcare promised in 93, 97, 2000. We're barely getting around to it now thanks to a minority parliament. We're finally making some movement. Pharmacare promised election after election. I guess the first place, Mr. Martin, I would suggest you apply your newfound belief in the keeping of promises is to yourself. The voters have a chance to send a message. Don't vote for a party that breaks its promises. Send some New Democrats to make sure they're kept.
Mr. Duceppe on promises.
Yes, well, I understand your concern, sir. Since I remember that the Liberals campaigned in 98 against free trade. In 1993, it was against NAFTA and the GST. First thing they've done once elected, they changed their mind. And this is why the population, and specifically you, is asking for something to break with that attitude and we have to do something. On the other hand, it'd be very tough to have a time frame. I don't think it'd be realistic, since things could occur in life. I remember 9/11 in 2001. Then all your priorities are changing, and you have to adapt to that new situation. But between that and between promising something and doing just the opposite, I think there's an ocean, and that ocean's named liberal. That's the problem.
Thank you very much. And one more question on ethics and governance, this one from Doris Ames of Manitoba, and Mr. Layton will ask you to respond to her.
My name is Doris Ames, and I'm from Winnipeg, Manitoba. And I'm a little concerned about how Parliament is going to work after this election. I would like to know from the leaders, if their party should win the election, do they have a plan to ensure that all MPs from all parties will set aside their partisan infighting and get down to work on the nation's business?
Well, thank you very much, Doris. And, you know, I almost feel like you must have been listening to Ed Broadbent in his final speech in the House, where he spoke about the need for parliamentarians to focus on the needs of people. And I have to say, this is what the New Democrats have been doing in this last Parliament. Our focus has been to try and produce results. We saw a lot of political games. I remember certain times in the House when it fell into chaos and teachers bringing their students would tell the students as they leave, "Don't you ever behave like that." It was shameful. Tape-recorded conversations, name-calling, a ruckus in the House all the time. We went to work on the budget, for example. We improved that budget and took the corporate tax cut away that Mr. Martin wanted to give and put it directly to the things people needed. Things like post-secondary education and training, including for Aboriginals, affordable housing, including for Aboriginals, and also for the environment, public transit, and foreign aid. That's the kind of practical approach that we will take, and we'll do more if you're able to join me in sending more New Democrat MPs to the House.
Mr. Harper.
Doris, I do think there's some obligation in a minority parliament for the parties to attempt to work together. I know that from the first day of this parliament, I met with Mr. Layton and Mr. Duceppe. We worked on some issues of common interest on the throne speech. We changed some of the rules in the House of Commons. And throughout this parliament, I think our party tried to work in a reasonable way and very often did a number of agreements with other parties that we always honor. The problem in this parliament was that the governing party, the Liberal Party, would not accept that it didn't have a majority. It simply has that arrogance deeply instilled. That's why in the end, when this government was defeated, it was not defeated simply by our party members or Mr. Duceppe or even Mr. Layton's, but even by two members who had been elected under the banner of the Liberal Party of Canada. A minority Conservative government will proceed with the promises we've run on. We'll keep our commitments to Canadians, but we will also try and work constructively with the opposition parties to make the Parliament function.
How do you like that, Mr. Duceppe?
Yes, the Bloc has never that, I would say, blind, stupid partisan attitude of saying we're against that proposal because it comes from the Liberal or the NDP or the Tories. We don't mind. The only questions we're asking ourselves, is it good for Quebec's interests or not? If it is, we're supporting it. If not, we're opposing it. I think this is the way the population is expecting their representatives to work in the House of Commons. And I don't know how many times I've heard Mr. Martin saying the Bloc is just there to block and not supporting the bills we're proposing. Well, you know, the figures are saying just the opposite. There were 60 bills passed since the last election. We voted with the Liberals 82% of the time, with the Conservative 83% of the times, and with the NDP 88% of the times. So those figures, you can check those figures. And it shows that the Bloc is there not to stop the Parliament from working, but to work with the other parties when Quebec's interests are at stake. And this is exactly what we're doing.
Mr. Martin, what do you think about minority government working?
Well, I think minority government can work when, in fact, the opposition parties want to make it work. And I tell you what's happening in Parliament is very much what we're seeing here, and that is the party leaders, the opposition party leaders, totally focused on the negative, totally pessimistic as to the future of the country. And I've got to tell you, I'm incredibly optimistic about the future of our country, and I believe that Parliament ought to be. And this kind of attitude is exactly the kind of thing that just poisoned the last Parliament, made question period impossible, made legitimate debate impossible. And that's why Canadians, I think, really are quite legitimately upset. The Canada of today may not be perfect, but I can tell you it's a lot better than most countries, and we are succeeding. If you take a look at what we welcome people to this country, we've got a great deal of social cohesion, we balanced our books, we're building a stronger economy, we're protecting our social programs. The fact is that Canada, and I'm not asking the opposition leaders to basically accept everything the government does, but what I am saying is let's work together for the betterment of Canadians. When there's an election, we'll have an election, but let's make Parliament work.
Well, you mentioned question period, and boy, did we get mail on question period. And it brought back an experience that I had that I thought was amusing when I had the occasion to attend question period in the company of a rock star who said afterwards that he was appalled and shocked by the behavior in question period. So when you're shocking rock stars with your behavior, it's something that Canadians are really concerned about. What can Canadians do to ensure that there is dignity, respect, and civility in the House of Commons, Mr. Harper?
Well, I'm not sure it's easy for Canadians. It is incumbent upon us. It's great to say that question period is raucous. It is. It's often very frustrating. The frustration the opposition feels, I think, is we ask legitimate questions and don't get answers. We get insulted. We've tried our best, is all I can say. I think that's true of all the opposition leaders. When this Parliament began, the three opposition leaders reached an agreement on some changes to the throne speech that Mr. Martin ultimately supported, but not before he threatened an election and a crisis in Parliament. If the government, sets the agenda, it has to want to make...
Thanks, we appreciate that. Mr. Layton.
Well, I've told my caucus that we won't shout out and disrupt Parliament. And I think there's one other thing that we should do, quite frankly, and that's have a lot more women in Parliament. I'm very happy that our party has the highest percentage of women candidates ever that any political party has presented in a federal election, 37%. And mark my words, the tone of that House would change if we had a lot more women there, and voting NDP will help make that happen.
Thank you. Mr. Duceppe?
I think each of us has to make an effort. But I would say it shouldn't be only question period. It should be also answer period. And it's very frustrating when you're questioning a minister and they're just refusing to answer a question. And suddenly, after a few weeks, when it is evident, then they come with something you are asking for. I think that attitude is very bad, and it has very severe consequences on the attitude of all the members in the House.
Mr. Martin, on civility.
Well, it shouldn't take a miracle to have civility. I mean, civility should be the normal way, and in fact, it should be simply the party leader should agree that that's the way it's going to happen. But I've got to say one thing. I do agree with Jack Layton. When you talk to women about running, the first thing that they raise is just the impossibility of dealing in Parliament and their view on question period. And they say, I can do so much better, I can do so much more good elsewhere. I do believe that, in fact, we're turning people off the political process. And I do believe that we have a responsibility to have far greater civility and basically have Parliament should be where the great national debates take place.
Thank you. Mr. Duceppe, do you think that the media encourages politicians to behave in an uncivil or disruptive way?
Well, certain sense, tough to say, because when we have a question period, let's say, that there's nothing very spectacular, it appears it's not on TV that night. So, but on the other hand, could we do it another way? I think we should, and I don't want to blame the media on that.
Mr. Martin, does the media reward bad behavior?
I don't think that we should be looking for scapegoats. The politicians should be able to control, in fact, what they're doing. They should control their destiny, and politicians have the responsibility to make Parliament work, and I don't think that we should try to put the blame on anybody else.
What do you think, Mr. Harper?
Well, I think there's no doubt that the media tends to focus more on confrontation, which is why we have the focus on question period as opposed to committees and opposed to other debates. Now, the media has set up the format to a large degree of this debate, which provides information, and I hope the viewers will find this a more effective forum than the confrontational styles.
And Mr. Layton.
Well, some journalists, I suppose, might be more interested in sports. I think that's probably true from time to time. They like to see some action. But actually, the issues we are dealing with is very serious, which is why our party has focused on respect and dignity in the House, and we were very moved by Ed Broadbent's statement to that effect as he left. He saw it very much changed.
Thank you. Let's move now to our third theme, which is economy, taxes, and trade. And the first question from Edmonton, Alberta, Mr. Derek Weimer, and Mr. Layton, when you've heard the question, we'd like you to respond.
I'm Derek Weimer from Edmonton, Alberta. My question is, the Liberals are proposing to spend $11 billion on a national daycare program. Wouldn't it be more effective to have that money flow directly to families so they can choose the right child care for their needs?
Mr. Layton.
Well, frankly, what we've seen from the Liberals on childcare is promises. We just haven't seen the delivery, and that's the challenge that we're facing now, is how to make sure that, in fact, the childcare spaces that people need are going to be available. What the NDP proposes is to invest in creating those spaces now. 200,000 new spaces right away, and 25,000 more spaces each year following. Now, this is significant because it means that then families will have the choice to be able to have their child cared for in a quality, non-profit, public sector child care facility. Right now, hundreds of thousands of families just simply don't have that choice at all. Mr. Harper wants to give a small amount of money that isn't going to pay for it. Mr. Martin, broken promises, and of course we hear about beer and popcorn, and then further assistance coming out and talking about cars and coats. This doesn't show respect for families. The NDP will make sure we get a child care program because it's important for the economy.
Thank you. Mr. Harper.
I wish I'd caught this gentleman's name because he's absolutely correct.
Derek
actually, the Conservative Party platform does have two child care elements. The Conservative government will implement a federal tax credit to assist employers and community associations with the capital costs in the creation of daycare spaces. But most of our money will go in a choice in child care allowance. It will be $1,200 a year for every child under the age of 6 years old. That allowance can be used in any method for any method of child care a parent wants to pursue, whether it's a parent staying at home, using institutional care, or more informal care through a friend and a relative. It will be taxable only in the hands of the lowest income earning spouse. Now, I know that the other parties want to create a daycare system, but we've seen some programs, these costs get 85% of the money gets eaten up in administration costs. Money has to go directly to parents. Only the Conservative Party will provide that kind of support.
Mr. Duceppe on childcare.
Well, I disagree with Mr. Harper on that issue. I think that the childcare program in Quebec is very good. It was recognized by the rest of Canada as the best program existing, and I think it's the best program in North America. And after a long months of negotiations with Ottawa, finally Quebec came to a deal with Ottawa. And we're receiving for this year $165 million. But on the other hand, since the fiscality is not serving Quebec at all, considering the child care and the deduction for child care fees, and we're losing each year $250 million. So all in all, it's a loss of $85 million for this year. And the fiscality has to change if we want to have a better child care program in Quebec, and respecting the fact that Quebec made a lot of efforts in the past to come to that achievement of having the best program in North America.
Mr. Martin.
Childcare has to provide parents with choice. And what that means is more spaces, it means more childcare workers, it means care that is high quality, and it means a focus on early learning and development. And that's what our plan does. And the fact is we have now signed with 10 provinces across the country. Think about what we have done. Within 17 months, we have done that. This is the first new social program of this generation. And the fact is that Mr. Harper wants to renege on it. He says he's going to kill that plan, one that has now been signed by the provinces. The fact is that what Mr. Harper is offering is not a child care plan. He's offering a certain amount of money, and that money is welcomed, as is the National Child Benefit. But that's not a child care plan. That's not a strategy. That's not a new system. That will help people who have found child care, but it does nothing for those who can't find high-quality child care. And that's the real issue here.
Thank you. And our next question on the economy, tax and trade is from Fredericton, New Brunswick, Krista Chapman. And Mr. Harper, we're going to ask you to respond to her.
Hi, I'm Krista Chapman here in Fredericton, New Brunswick. All too often, Atlantic Canada is seen as a have-not area, a region constantly begging for scraps from the Canadian table. Young people in Atlantic Canada suffer, and many resort to drugs and alcohol. To escape the despair created by unemployment, many are forced into the western provinces. As a young Newfoundlander away from my home province, I want to know what strategies you will adopt, if elected, to make a future for young, rural Atlantic Canadians. Thanks.
I appreciate the question. The Harper family settled in New Brunswick in 1774, and there are still relatives there, but my direct line lived there for generations. My father was forced to leave early in the 50s to seek employment opportunities elsewhere. I believe that if we have correct federal policies that allow Atlantic Canada to control its own resources, and federal policies that are not partisan, don't just reward the friends of the government, then Atlantic Canada can succeed and can produce as many jobs as any other part of the country. We want to create a good economic environment across this country. It's one of the reasons we want to cut taxes, not just for big business, but for small and medium-sized business as well, that create a lot of the jobs, particularly in the regions. We need to have regional strategies and strategies for particular rural sectors, such as the fishery. That's why I think it's so important. We've announced that we're going to make sure that there's a capital gains exemption for fishermen who want to pass on their business to their children, something they often can't do now. So it's going to require a whole range and a strategy to build the economy across the country.
Mr. Layton.
Well, it's good to hear the question, Krista, and from New Brunswick. We have common roots, it turns out, geographically. I'm the Steves family from 1765 in Hillsborough, New Brunswick. And you know, it's true. Far too many young people have had to leave Atlantic Canada. Why? First of all, the employment isn't available, and the unemployment insurance program doesn't provide the help when they need it, whether it's with seasonal work, tourism, the fishery, forestry, that sort of thing. Instead, the profits, the surplus is scooped by Mr. Martin and the Liberals to give a corporate tax cut to someone else. Secondly, there's no investment in post-secondary education there would be, so that is needed. So you end up with this debt on students' shoulders, and they have to go and find work to pay it off, and they can't get their families started. We need regional development strategies that actually work with industries, not just corporate tax cuts that don't produce a single job, no requirement for results. Let's get some results with New Democrats like Yvonne Gaudin and the team in New Brunswick and Atlantic Canada.
Mr. Martin, have you got any Atlantic Canada roots?
Well, it would appear that my colleagues are related to virtually everybody. The fact is, yes, but and I also very much agree with the question that was really put, especially in saying that this is really a rural-urban problem. The fact is, if you look at St. John's, if you look at Moncton, you look at Halifax, the major cities are doing well. The problem is really outside of the major cities in Atlantic Canada, and that's what we've got to focus on. That's why ACOA is so important. That's why our ability to really provide educational institutions with a reach-out far beyond the larger cities is so important. Means better infrastructure. It means access to road, access to markets. It means better retraining. It means retraining for the industries that are there. It means retraining for the kinds of industries that come in. When you talk to people in Atlantic Canada, what they'll tell you is, we can bring the companies here if, in fact, you give us the retraining, if, in fact, you'll give us the infrastructure that will support them. And that's what you really got to do, and you've got to be very proactive. This is not something that you just simply take for granted. It isn't only going to be taxes.
Thank you. Mr. Duceppe.
Well, I said earlier that $48 billion were taken off the pockets of the unemployed since the Liberals took power in 1993. So it means with that money we could have done a lot of things. First of all, a better access to the employment insurance. We have to remember that young people have to do more hours than the senior, than the other people to have access to the employment insurance. So it means those young people are going elsewhere in big cities, and they don't necessarily come back to their place. And a lot of times, those young people are also working in the sectors that are facing huge challenges with the globalization. I'm thinking of the softwood lumber problem. I'm thinking of the textile and clothing industries. And I'm also thinking, in your place, of the disaster the Federals made in the fisheries sector. I think all those things could have went better if that money was used properly.
Well, Mr. Duceppe, you'll get a chance to talk about softwood lumber again with this next question from Gina Walker.
My name is Gina Walker, and I'm in Mrs. Lorraine Wellham's grade 12 social studies class at Central Memorial High School in Calgary. Do any of the leaders believe that we should renegotiate NAFTA in light of the problems we have had with softwood lumber?
Well, I think one thing we have to look with NAFTA is certainly the dispute mechanism, and we have to look back at that, and also to change Chapter 11 of NAFTA. Having said that, The problem with the softwood lumber is not NAFTA, is the fact the Americans are not respecting their own signature on the NAFTA paper. And we told the government 3 years ago that we have to help our industries and the workers in that sector. Because the American strategy is very clear. They know they will lose at the end, but they say they will make sure that the legal procedures are long enough that the day they lose, the winners won't be there anymore. This is why we have to give loan guarantees to those companies. The government finally accepted to give some, but not enough, only $800 million instead of the $5 billion those companies were the money went to the United States. And they have to give also better access to unemployment insurance for those who lost their job in that sector.
Mr. Layton, your comments on NAFTA.
Well, I'm glad the question's been raised because the independence of Canada has been fundamentally challenged by the Americans and the way they've behaved under NAFTA. And our government has refused to respond. Simple talk is all we get, phone calls. We don't get real action. That's why we've proposed that a countervail strategy needs to be used. Mr. Mulroney used it in the past to show that we were serious when our industries are under attack. But NAFTA also contains provisions around energy that denies us our own sovereignty around energy and therefore around environmental issues. We can't protect our water from the possibility of it becoming a commodity that gets traded under NAFTA. I can't imagine losing a more important fundamental to our sovereignty. Also our social services, whether it's childcare or whether it's healthcare, to the extent that it becomes corporatized and turned into a profit-based commodity, which Profit Magazine says is happening, contrary to what Mr. Martin tries to claim. All of these things mean that NAFTA has to be completely reworked, and it's a priority for the NDP.
And Mr. Martin.
There's no doubt that the Americans have got to honor the agreement, and I have made that very clear. And I have also said that, in fact, we are not going to sit down and renegotiate until such time as the gains which we have won through the NAFTA panel are settled. But let me put this also in a wider context. We are 32 million people. We're going to be 40 million people in the not-too-distant future. We will be exporting to China. We'll be exporting to India, to Russia, and to the United States and Europe. And we have got to insist that these nations honor their agreements. And that's why what's happening now in NAFTA is so important. It's also very clear that we have got to say that the Canadian government will stand behind our exporting industries when in fact they are being dealt with unfairly by other countries. That's why we brought in the forestry plan. That's why we have made it very clear that if any foreign government does not honor agreement and fools around with our industries, our communities and our workers, we will stand behind them. We will not allow Canadian workers to bear the brunt of somebody else not living up to the terms of their agreements.
Mr. Harper.
Yeah, thank you, Gina, for that question. Notwithstanding this problem, which I think is very serious, I still believe that NAFTA is critical for Canada. So many of our jobs and so much of our trade depend on the access we do have to the American market. If anything, we have to look at how to improve that access to the American market. That said, we do have a problem here. It's a big problem. It's not good enough when we have a problem like this to just shout anti-American rhetoric from across the border. We have to actually take action. We have to be prepared to look at retaliatory measures. We have to back our industry. That's why all the opposition parties, for 3 years, have been demanding the government provide loan guarantees for illegal American duties, something the government ruled out until the eve of an election campaign. I think we also have to find a way of engaging the United States on this. I want to talk to the President after I'm elected to see if we can appoint special envoys to have a discussion about our trade relationship in a way that will improve access, improve the dispute settlement mechanism for the benefit of both countries.
Well, of course, NAFTA brings us into the wider question of American-Canadian relations, and they certainly have been heating up lately. Some people think that defying Bush's America is good politics, and the polls seem to agree with that. Is it good government, Mr. Martin?
I call it like I see it, and if that offends some people, then it's going to offend them. But I'm going to stand up for Canada. The fundamental difference between Mr. Harper and myself is that I went on American TV and said to the Americans they are wrong in not honoring the agreement. Mr. Harper went on American TV and said to the Americans that we were wrong when we didn't join the Americans in the invasion of Iraq. I don't believe you could criticize Canada on foreign networks, but I do believe you go to the American people when they're wrong and you tell them that.
Mr. Harper?
Well, I gave my reaction to the U.S. failure to conform with NAFTA right after that treaty. I didn't wait 64 days, which Mr. Martin waited, to call the President of the United States to express our concerns. But let me address the question of Iraq, because Mr. Martin keeps saying this. Earlier this year, Mr. Martin wanted to send Canadian troops to Iraq. I rejected that idea. When I did so, he withdrew the idea. This is recorded on page 165 of former Ambassador Cellucci's book, and I challenge Canadians to take a look at it and see the real flip-flops of Mr. Martin.
Thank you. Can we talk about U.S.-America relations, Mr. Layton?
Well, yes, and what we've seen from Mr. Martin is the picking of phony battles. And you know, when you pick a phony battle, you're going to have to deal with the consequences. I asked Mr. Martin, when he's pointing his fingers, to take a look at his own record, because you have allowed, Mr. Martin, our emissions to go up 24%, and yet you tried to lecture the Americans whose greenhouse gas emissions are going up by less than half, roughly half of that amount. It's hypocrisy for
Thank
you
you,
to be
Mr. Layton.
pointing your finger
Mr.
at the
Duceppe.
Americans when you don't deliver on your own promises. For
Thank
the
you,
environment.
Mr. Layton. Mr. Duceppe.
I think too often Paul Martin's strategy is only words and no action. And the softwood dispute is the best example of all. Since 3 years we've been asking a strategy to help the industries, to help the workers who lost their job. It affects a lot of regions around Canada, not only in Quebec, I know, also north of Ontario and BC. And they did nothing. They were even saying that loan guarantees were not acceptable under NAFTA rules and the WTO rules, which is not true. Finally, a few days before the election, they accepted our plan.
Thank you.
Part of it.
You know, Ambassador Wilkins made a lot of news when he said that it's not good to criticize a friend constantly and never mention the friend's achievements. Mr. Layton, you on friendship with the Americans?
Whenever I talk about the Americans, I always say that we are best friends. We have so many friends in the U.S. In fact, there are millions of Americans who wish that they had our healthcare system and want to work with us on how to achieve it, who have concerns about NAFTA, who believe that the war in Iraq should never have taken place. And I wish Mr. Martin had spoken up on that issue during that important debate, rather than
Mr. Duceppe.
after the fact.
Well, former Ambassador Cellucci wrote in his book that a lot of time the Bloc Québécois has a very different opinion of the U.S. administration. But he said also, and this is very important, that never we said something anti-American in our intervention, which was not the case with the Liberals.
Mr. Martin, friendship.
If I can just correct the record, I have never once said that I would send troops to Iraq, nor did I contemplate it. The training that we're doing in Jordan is an example of that. What we're doing in Afghanistan is an example of that. And what Mr. Harper has said is simply untrue. Now, absolutely with the United States, we're very close friends. And we should recognize that. But when we have a disagreement, like on climate change, like on softwood, then we should not be afraid to tell
Thank you very much, Mr. Martin. Mr. Harper on friendship.
Yeah, thank you very much. The Americans are our best friend, our closest ally, and our most important trading partner. We should never forget that. It's important for a prime minister to keep relations as good as we can while standing up for our real interests. This government has engaged in a series of phony and reckless wars of words with the United States that does not help this economy or Canadians.
Thank you. Next question on tape from Dorothy Hunter in Ontario, and we'll ask Mr. Martin to respond first.
Hello, my name is Dorothy Hunter, and I'm from Orillia, Ontario. I'm a physically challenged, mature adult. I am not, nor have been, in the workforce for at least 20 years. However, every time I buy something, I have to pay the GST. Could you please explain in a clear, concise manner how a reduction in the personal income tax, as opposed to one in the GST, will help me and thousands of others like me put food on my table and pay my bills? Thank you very much.
Because, well, first of all, thank you very much for your question. And the fact is that we have made it very clear that we're going to focus on personal income taxes because it will put much more money into your pockets. Let me just simply give you an example. You would have to spend something like $40,000 in non-mortgage, non-food spending if you were a typical Canadian family, simply to get the same savings that we're talking about in terms of the GST. What we believe is the best way is, in fact, to provide people with a personal income tax cut that puts more money in their pocket. Refundable if, in fact, they're not paying taxes is certainly one way to go. We also believe that people who are physically disabled, that we've set up a special fund that will enable them to, in fact, get into the workforce if it's possible, or tax credits to enable you to do it. We believe that putting money into your hands and letting you decide how to spend it is by far the best way to go.
Thank you, Mr. Martin. Mr. Duceppe.
Yes, I think we have to use the personal income tax, first of all, to reduce it for important categories of our society, and to come with also a specific program addressing the situation that is yours. And I think also that we have to have a better health care. So it means that there's more payment transfer to the provinces. All in all, I think it's to be sure that the people having problems in our society will have conditions that make possible for them to act, to live in our society. It's a society that should be based on solidarity and taking into account that not everyone have the same chances in life.
Thank you. Mr. Harper.
Yes, this voter is absolutely correct. When people talk about cutting just personal income tax, that will leave out 32% of Canadians who don't file personal income tax or don't pay personal income tax. That's why a Conservative government will cut the GST. We will cut it from 7% to 6% immediately to 5% over the course of our mandate to make sure every single Canadian receives a tax cut. We will also proceed with some targeted tax reductions in other areas for small business, some targeted income tax reductions for the seniors in particular circumstances, for people who have kids in sports, for transit riders. But we want to make sure that all of our tax cuts are tax cuts that people can see, that they can count on, and that no politician's going to be able to take away without them noticing. The only way to make sure there's a progressive tax reduction, which all Canadians need and all Canadians get, is to cut the GST, and that's what we will do.
Mr. Layton.
What we need to do is make sure that people like yourself, Dorothy, and all Canadians who are struggling with low-income challenges get the help that they need. And a GST cut sounds certainly very attractive, a few pennies here and there. But the fact is that it's not going to lift people out of poverty. And what we need is a strategy to do exactly that. But unfortunately, right now, we're faced with the choice of a program for a huge corporate income tax cut giveaway right now as a top priority for Mr. Martin. We believe that's not the top priority, and that there should be investments in the key areas that can help people have a quality of life. And also, we need to have a Disabilities Act that sets out the support that should be available for people who want to work but have a disability, for people who are unable to work but need that basic level of support. Growing up in Montreal, in a family that was founded and led by a blind man who worked for the pensions for the blind, this is an issue very important to us. And we want to see those changes.
Thank you. You know, Mr. Martin, one of the things that has emerged in the emails we got is that people are now getting confused over the wild array of rebates, write-offs, targeted cuts, this, that. Is tax policy, is good tax policy a matter of rewarding or encouraging behavior, or is it to collect the money that we need to provide services for Canadians?
Well, it certainly is to collect the money that we need to pay for health care, to pay for education, and it should be as simple as possible. That's why we focus on personal tax cuts, because it is simple and it gets more money into people's pockets. But you have to recognize that there are people like Dorothy who have special needs. And so we have brought in a number of disability tax credits and tax incentives and aids, direct funding, because you can't, through any tax system, really help somebody like Dorothy who really requires that kind of help.
Mr. Layton.
Well, first of all, Mr. Martin talks about how we need to raise the funds for the services that are required and the investments, but his actions completely belie what he's saying. He's right now proposing a $10 billion corporate tax giveaway. Huge. Corporations don't need it. Paul Somerville, one of our candidates, former RBC chief economist, points out that that's not the way to create the stronger economy. And Mr. Martin, I'd ask you to answer the question sometime during this evening. Maybe you can't do it right now.
Thank you.
Will you cancel the $10 billion corporate tax giveaway?
Mr. Martin. Mr. Harper, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Trina. I think the truth is that a taxation system has a number of different purposes. Its central purpose is to raise money. It can also have effects or incentives for economic growth. It can also reward or encourage certain social objectives, the most obvious being, for instance, giving to charity and deductions for that. That's why we're introducing a series of things to reward, for instance, reward transit users who use mass transit to encourage healthy environmental practices. If I could just clarify one point on the GST, because it is confusing. I want to be clear that I want to make sure everybody's clear. We will not reduce the GST rebate to low-income people. That will not be
Thank you. Mr. Duceppe.
Yes, I would say it's very tough to follow the Liberals. In last February, they were saying the surpluses will be around $4 billion. The Bloc said at that time will be around $9 billion. And again, the Liberals were saying that's pure fantasy. And then a few weeks before launching an election, they found $11 billion. So people are asking themselves, how come all that money suddenly before an election, and where will that money go? When it's tough to believe that they didn't know last February, and we didn't have time to have a debate on how to use those.
Well, talking about surpluses, Mr. Harper, is a surplus, a big one, a sign of good fiscal planning, or is it a sign of not so good fiscal planning?
I think actually it's a sign of not good fiscal planning. I know that we should not run deficits, and we don't want to run deficits, but when surpluses appear out of thin air, I think that's a sign of bad fiscal management, or even worse, of dishonest fiscal management that attempts to do a lot of spending off budget and has led to a lot of the corruption.
What do you think about surpluses, Mr. Martin?
Well, first of all, I'm going to just ask Mr. Layton's question. The fact is 90% of our tax cuts are personal tax cuts, primarily going to middle income and low income Canadians. And so I will not cancel them. Now, the fact is, all you have to do is think where we were 10, 15 years ago. Who could imagine we'd be debating surpluses? I mean, this is a phenomenal turnaround, and one that's very healthy for the country.
Thank you very much, Mr. Martin. Mr. Duceppe.
Well, I think it shows something very clear. There's too much money in Ottawa and not enough in the provinces. And the provinces are the ones facing the huge challenges of the healthcare system and the education system. And this is what we call fiscal imbalance. Everybody recognizes that in Canada, except the Liberals.
Mr. Layton, what do you think about surplus?
Well, I'm glad Mr. Martin answered the question, because now people have that very clear choice. They can support the same old from the parties, from Mr. Martin, who wants to give another huge corporate tax cut to his friends, a big tax giveaway, or he can support the New Democrats, who last time prevented him from doing it and put money into housing and environment.
Thank you, Mr. Layton. And we turn now to our final theme of the night, and it is a very important one, the question of national unity. Let's have our first question to Mr. Duceppe.
This is Samim Amanzada in Calgary. Is there anything the next government can do to make Quebec sovereigntists feel part of Canada?
Well, I think we have that debate since quite a long time now. And I think that when we had that referendum on Charlottetown back in 1992 after the Meech failure, I think we have to realize nowadays that Canada is building itself the way Canadians want Canada to work. And Quebec doesn't feel at ease at all in that scenario. I think that the best way would be to be inspired by the situation in Europe, where we find independent countries, sovereign countries, getting together but staying sovereign countries and voluntarily sharing things in common. This is what I think we have to do. We're not reacting against Canada. I think Canada is a great country. I think Canadians are a great nation. But we're different, not inferior, not superior, just plain different, and we should accept that and work on that base.
Mr. Layton, do you agree?
Well, I think what's happened here is that we're seeing the same old debates of the past, and I'm hoping we can move beyond them. Unfortunately, one of the biggest aids to the growth of support for the Bloc, with all due respect, Mr. Duceppe, and the Parti Québécois, has been the scandal that has taken place, the misuse of tax dollars to try and buy the support of Quebecers for our country. And naturally, Quebecers have reacted very negatively to this. I grew up in Quebec. I passionately want to build the kind of Canada in which Quebec will feel respected, celebrated, and a part of building what we can build for this great country. And rewarding the Liberals for what they've done will send a message to Quebecers that they're not respected. What we need to do is, first, stop the corruption and the behavior of the Liberals. Second, start working on common projects like we did with our budget, investing in places, in issues that are important. And lastly, open the door to reconciliation, a new path forward for Canada.
Mr. Martin.
Quebecers have a deep attachment to Canada. And what they want is they want to be recognized for who they are, their language, their culture, their distinct character. What Quebecers want, they want to be respected, and they want to know where their role is within Canada. Think about what's happened here. 6 million people of an English-speaking population of 300 million, and they have got some of the greatest artists in the world, some of the greatest writers. There's an enormous dynamism in Quebec, and they want Canada to understand it, and I believe that Canada does. And I think that what they also want to understand, they built this country. We have built this country together. If you go back 150 years, we understood that we had to pull together to make it happen, and the same thing applies today. So I believe that what Quebecers want is exactly the same thing as anybody wants in Calgary. They want their children to have a good life. They want to be able to have great national objectives that they can live to. They want social programs which mean that they count. Fundamentally, what Quebecers want is to be part of a country that recognizes them and that is succeeding, and that's what we've got to offer.
Mr. Harper.
Well, I don't think, to be honest to our questioner, we're going to change the mind of every sovereignist. I don't think we'll change Mr. Duceppe's mind in my lifetime on this question. But the rise of support of the Bloc is not due to real support for sovereignty. It's a reaction to the corruption of the Liberal Party and the damage it's done to the face of federalism in Quebec. I think that damage has been compounded in this election by Mr. Martin, who continues to talk about a referendum and talk about Mr. Charest, the Premier of Quebec, as if he doesn't exist. This is the strongest Federalist Premier, a former Conservative leader, strongest Federalist Premier in my lifetime. He wants to make this country work. I want to work with him to make that country work. We have a team of candidates in Quebec, led by Lawrence Cannon, Joseph Henner, Jean-Pierre Blackburn, Daniel Fournier, Maxime Bernier, Andrea Payne, people of integrity, people who are committed to this country, and people who want to make sure that we work hard to create a stronger Quebec and respect for Quebec's powers and jurisdictions within a strong and united Canada.
A second question on the topic of unity, Mr. Don Matheson from Ontario, and we'll ask Mr. Layton if you'll respond to him.
My name is Don Matheson. I'm from Deserano, Ontario. If the PQ win an election and then hold and win a referendum by a simple majority, ignore the Clarity Act, and then declare Quebec to be a sovereign state, what action would your party take?
Well, thank you for the question. And of course, the Supreme Court has laid down fundamental principles on which we could move forward. They've been accepted very broadly, having to do with how these things should be conducted. But I want to pose a question to Canadians. Why is it that we're talking about how Quebec is going to leave Canada, instead of talking about what we can all do with Quebecers so that they will want to stay? Surely that is what we should be talking about, not the name-calling, the finger-pointing. It is really very destructive. I want us to look forward. I want us to build with Quebecers. And I want to show Quebecers that federalism can work for them. That's why we took that budget. We got rid of the corporate tax cut. I don't know very many Quebecers who thought it was a good idea. And we invested in social housing, public transit and the environment, post-secondary education and training, widely received positively in Quebec. That's a good example of how we can build for the future. We need to do more and reconcile our differences.
Thank you, Mr. Harper.
Yeah, thank you very much. The Supreme Court, as Mr. Layton says, has laid out some pretty clear directives on clarity and how to deal with such a situation. As Prime Minister of Canada, that would guide my actions, and it's always important for the Prime Minister's first priority to be to defend the unity of this country. I don't obviously want to go far down the path, so far down the path as this particular voter's talking. Well, let me just say this. The only way Quebec is ever going to separate from Canada is if we create a federal government that is so tarnished in their eyes, so corrupt, so disrespectful of their jurisdictions, that we drive them that way. Quebecers have an attachment to Canada. If we ever face another referendum, it's the responsibility of the Prime Minister to not make this a partisan issue, to work with all the Federalist parties and work with the Federalist leadership in Quebec to win that referendum. If federalism has a clean image, an honest image, and respects Quebec's powers and jurisdictions, we will never have to worry about Quebecers. They will always choose Canada.
Mr. Duceppe.
Well, you know, sir, that the Clarity Bill was unanimously denounced at the National Assembly in Quebec, not only by the PQ, the sovereigntists, but also by Mario Dumont's ADQ and Jean Charest, who Mr. Harper said he's a stronger provincial prime minister, federalist prime minister in Canada. Jean Charest also denounced the Clarity Bill. I think that the elected members of the National Assembly in Quebec are able to determine what is a clear question or not. Why would it be only the people sitting in the House of Commons able to do that? I think people in the National Assembly can do that. And will always act a responsible way. And the referendum we had in Quebec was a democratic exercise. It always will be a democratic exercise. And I think in the best mutual interest of both countries, if we succeed as sovereigntists, will be to start negotiating the better settlement, better deal for both countries.
Mr. Martin.
Mr. Duceppe, let me just simply say to you that the Supreme Court, the Constitution of Canada, and international law all make it very, very clear that you cannot have a unilateral declaration of independence. Let me say also that I am a Quebecer, and you are not going to take my country away from me with some trick, with some ambiguous question. You are not going to do an astuce, as Jacques Parizeau said. This is my country, and my children were born and raised in Quebec. And you're not going to go to them and say that you're going to find some backdoor way of taking my country or dividing Quebec family against Quebec family. And they're absolutely right. We do have an opportunity, and Quebecers understand this, to build a country which is without parallel. And if you take a look at the way that Canada is measuring up in terms of our economy, in terms of the strength of our social programs, in terms of our independent foreign policy, I believe that we do appeal to the deep attachment, the deep love of this country that Quebecers have. And you're not going to win, Mr. Duceppe, let me tell you that.
Well, I guess Mr. Matheson's question is not exactly that. Mr. Matheson's question is the question of supposing Quebec ignores everything that you're talking about and, as he says, declares Quebec to be a sovereign state. And Mr. Duceppe, I'll ask you to start with that. Is that a possibility? And the other leaders to say what happened?
I said we'll do it a responsible way. It means negotiating in good faith, exactly what the Supreme Court said in its advice. And we're respecting that because we've always done that. And it's surprising to see Mr. Martin telling me what he said when they just tried to buy Quebec vote, the Quebecers' vote with the ad scan. The same people who didn't respect the law in Quebec with the law in Montreal. And I asked Mr. Martin again to give the names of those who received dirty money trying to buy Quebecers' vote.
Well, Mr. Harper, Mr. Matheson again wonders what would happen if that vote occurs and the sovereignists win.
It's the responsibility of the Prime Minister to defend the rule of law. And I do want to say to Mr. Duceppe, he can't read half the Supreme Court judgment. The Supreme Court judgment talked about negotiations, but it also talked about the rule of law, the necessity of having a clear question, not a garbled question about partnership and association, a clear question with a clear majority. And I would just like to hear Mr. Duceppe say, and we know how strongly he believes in his cause, we respect it in this country, but that he will abide by the rule of law, and he'll urge Parti Québécois under all circumstances to always respect the rule of law.
However, it is Mr. Layton's turn to talk about that.
Well, first of all, I have to say that the solution here, and we've got to focus on a solution, not about how Quebec is going to leave or what happens if it does. We've got to build those bridges. That's what we should be doing. And I ask Mr. Martin, will you at least start by saying to the people of Quebec that the Liberal Party was wrong to try and buy their support? That is what has driven up the support for this idea of separating. And we have to start the reconciliation right there, sir.
Mr. Martin, your response.
Sovereignty is a question of international recognition, and you're not going to get international recognition if what you do is violate the Constitution of Canada, if you violate international law. The fact is that sovereignty would not arise in the way that the questioner put. And certainly, and as Prime Minister of this country, I will defend the unity of our land. Now, let me just say one thing. The question that you have asked, Judge Gomery has dealt with this issue the most extensively as possible. If you have a problem, go see Judge Gomery, go see the RCMP.
Thank you very much. Let's turn to another issue of national unity, Mr. Martin, and let's go to Red Deer, Alberta.
Hello, my name is Rob Stolarek. I'm from Red Deer, Alberta. In the last federal election campaign, Paul Martin vowed to address Western alienation, or in his words, his prime ministership would be a failure. My question to you is, what steps will your party take to address Western alienation?
Well, I think let's just look at the cabinet, whether it be Reg Alcock, the President of the Treasury Board, the Minister of Finance, Ralph Goodale, Anne McClellan, Deputy Prime Minister. In British Columbia, David Emerson, Raymond Chant, Ujjal Dosanjh, very senior cabinet ministers are from Western Canada. That's the first thing. The second thing is that if you look at the Pacific Gateway, let me just give you that one example. This is an enormous national undertaking. It applies all through Western Canada. And what it essentially says is that we recognize the great strength of Western Canada, the opening up to the Asia Pacific, and it's a national issue. What I said to Western Canadians is that never again would issues in Western Canada be treated as regional issues only, that they would be national issues. We did that in the case of forestry, we did it in the case of Mad Cow, but we're doing it in this great national undertaking, the Pacific Gateway. And so what I believe that we've got to do is to recognize the huge importance of Western Canada. I've done that within my government, and I will continue to do it.
Mr. Duceppe, your thoughts on
I think it's again words, and words. I think that the very first thing would be not to ignore important consensus existing between the provinces and even the opposition parties in Ottawa, like recognizing the fiscal imbalance. Only the Liberals are not recognizing that. All the provinces, all the opposition parties in Ottawa do recognize that. Secondly, to put an end to that mentality of Ottawa knows best, always intervening in provincial jurisdictions. This is what they've done for too long. And I think people are kind of fed up of hearing the Liberals telling them how to deal with health care when they don't manage and administer a single hospital, how to deal with schools when they don't know nothing in education. And I think they have to respect. He was talking about respecting the Constitution. This is a thing they're not doing every day of each year.
Thank you, Mr. Harper.
Thank you, Rob. I believe that Western Canadians are looking for more than just a change of government or particular policies. I'll emphasize that a Conservative government will continue full funding of the Pacific Gateway Initiative. It's important for British Columbia and for all of Western Canada. But I think what Western Canadians are actually looking for is really some modernization of our political system, some very fundamental political reform. Let me just mention three that we'll proceed with as a Conservative government. First of all, we're going to introduce fixed election dates, as has been done in British Columbia, so dates are not manipulated for the partisan benefit of the Prime Minister. We'll have more free votes in the House of Commons, but I think most importantly, a Conservative government will proceed with the election of senators. In the 21st century, it is not acceptable that a body that's supposed to represent the regions has people who are appointed. I will, as Prime Minister, make sure there is an electoral process across this country, and we will name senators who win elections from their members and proceed with more substantive Senate reforms after that.
Thank you. Mr. Layton.
Well, first of all, I think we have to respond by saying that the Liberals have damaged the relations with people in the West because they haven't responded on the key issues. Let's just go through a few of them. Ralph Goodale is not providing fairness for Saskatchewan. That's why you have people all across Saskatchewan raising a flag for fairness, because they're not being fairly treated right now. New Democrat MPs, when they're elected, will make sure they stand up for this, unlike Mr. Goodale. The wheat board is being threatened, not protected by the Liberal government. It's being traded away in negotiations far away. And our representatives from across the West, including our new candidate, Ed Schreier, a former Governor General, will stand up for these fundamental institutions. What about in British Columbia, where the natural gas and water distribution companies are now owned by Terrason, friend of George Bush? The Liberals wouldn't lift a finger to protect them, wouldn't even allow a public hearing. This is how disrespect begins to develop and alienation begins to develop. People wonder, who's speaking for us? New Democrats in the House will speak for you when you elect them.
Mr. Harper, do you think that Western alienation is a provincial situation? In other words, that people feel that their province doesn't have enough control over important issues, or that it's lack of representation in national institutions?
I actually think it's a combination of both, but I think the latter is more important. I think Western Canadians have almost universally, in spite of what you often hear, a profound and deep attachment to the country. I do think they feel that the system of government in Ottawa doesn't respond to their needs and is not set up to respond to their needs. And, you know, every federation in the world, every modern federation has an elected upper house to respond to regional concerns. And I think we've got to get on with creating that kind of a system in this country.
Mr. Duceppe, what do you think? Is it national?
I would say I understand the frustration, but I think it's very different from the situation in Quebec, and it's not to me to tell them what to do. But I would say that the way I see it is that West wants in and Quebec wants out.
Okay. Mr. Layton, what about the West being in?
Well, I think it's a question of having voices from Western Canada who speak up for them in the House. We haven't seen that from the Conservatives. They've been a very ineffectual opposition, no question about it. And the Liberals have not followed through. They make promises at election time, but they just haven't followed through. So I think it's a question of electing new Democrats. I honestly believe that if we have stronger representation from the West, from the Democrats, you will see the voices being raised. Our caucus has proven it. Our members have proven it. And that's the kind of reform that we really need, is change in this next election.
And your reform, Mr. Martin?
Look, there's no doubt. I believe that Western alienation is a reality. It's not a myth. And it is answered by having very senior people as part of the fundamental part of government. And that's what, in fact, Ralph Goodale, who does work very hard for Saskatchewan, is all about. It's also what the important decisions in terms of the Wheat Board, in terms of the Pacific Gateway are all about. The fact is that we are delivering on that. Western Canada has got to see that it is part of the decision-making process nationally, and it most certainly is.
Does it mean, we've heard about Atlantic provinces who are concerned about their part in federation. We've certainly heard Mr. Duceppe's opinion. We've certainly heard even Ontario talking about a fiscal imbalance. We've heard the Western alienation. How can a federal party leader deal with a country where each segment seems to be saying something's wrong here? Mr. Layton?
Well, I think it's a question of investing in the different parts of the country according to their priorities and needs. That's the key. And so what we've got to do is enable ourselves to make those key investments. I used to be the president of the Canadian Federation of Municipalities across the country. That's what the communities are calling for. A big corporate tax cut, that's one choice. The investments are another.
Mr. Layton. Mr. Martin, your thoughts on
Well, in fact, some people have described Canada as a country that doesn't work in theory but only works in practice, and we work very, very well in practice. And I must say that the whole municipalities agenda, the communities agenda, which had a huge Western involvement, in fact demonstrates how you can reach directly out and deal with those people who are on really right in the front line.
Mr. Duceppe, do you think the rest of Canada is as eager for redress as Quebec?
I would say that I think there's a nation-building process in Canada to face and challenge our globalized world. The problem is Quebec doesn't feel at ease in that process. We want to have our own nation-building process, and I think as two sovereign countries, it'd be better to
Thank you. And Mr. Harper?
Well, I won't kid you, Trina. It's a tough country to govern. It's a big, empty country. We have to travel a lot to hear the different concerns in different parts of the country. But I think ultimately to govern it properly, like any modern federation, we need two houses, one elected by population, another elected by regional representation to deal with this problem permanently.
Thank you very much. And for a final question on national unity, and in fact the final question of the evening, we'd like to go right here to British Columbia, but out to White Rock. And Mr. Harper, this is a question for you and the other leaders.
Hi, I'm Andrea Nair from White Rock, British Columbia. I feel that Canada has become essentially leaderless, with no clear vision and more energy spent on reacting to disasters than inspiring us to be better people. So, party platform aside, what is your big picture vision for Canada in the future? What does your Canada look like in 50 years? Thank you.
Those are the toughest questions to answer, especially when you've got a clock running. Look, Canada has really resources and a landmass and natural resources unparalleled on this planet. We have a population that in a few short generations, people of ambition and energy have been drawn from all corners of the earth. I believe that Canada should have the wealthiest economy, highest standard of living, the best social services, and the highest standards of democracy in the world. I don't think we should settle for anything less. That's the kind of Canada I want to see for my children and hopefully for their children as well.
Mr. Martin.
Well, my vision of Canada is a country that essentially sets the standard by which other countries and other peoples judge themselves. It's a country with strong social programs so that no one is ever left behind. It's a country that pays for those social programs with a very strong economy, one that is focused really, to begin with, on our natural resources, but primarily on a very strong educational system. It is a country that speaks on the world stage with an independent voice, a country that projects its values, that protects its interests, and that essentially says to the world, we are where the world is going, not where it has been. We are a multicultural nation. We have phenomenal assets. And we've got to basically say, this is indeed the model that others can follow. And we're doing that. Look at our social cohesion compared to others. It is a country that never forgets our values: generosity, respect for diversity, equality of opportunity. We are indeed a nation blessed. And we have got to make sure that generations that follow us understand that, and that the world sees it as well.
Mr. Layton.
50 years from now, a country where sustainable development and harmony with our environment has been achieved, perhaps even sooner. A country where working families know that when they go to work, there's going to be the basics for them there, a decent standard of living, education for their kids. Too many are losing that right now. Their seniors being looked after at the tail, at those wonderful years at the end of their hard work. The investment in our economy, in the infrastructure, is there and established. It's a country where people come from all parts of the world knowing that they're not going to get a second-class status, which we're seeing right now, but they will be full participants in everything that goes on in this amazing country. A country where our voice in the world isn't something we just talk about, but we deliver. And we can look back and say, we delivered on helping the AIDS crisis in Africa. We delivered with peacekeepers around the world that we can support on an ongoing basis. That's my vision.
And Mr. Duceppe, I imagine you have a different vision.
Yes, I have. I think in 50 years we'll have two sovereign countries, one named Quebec, one named Canada, respecting each other. Because two democratic countries participating in larger economic and political institutions, like maybe a larger NAFTA, just like there's a larger Europe today. I think this is the way of the future. And Bill Clinton in 1998 in Tabla described pretty well the evolution that Canada should take. He said, with the example of the United States, we're taking political decisions in Washington, and then we'll look who's best placed to apply them, being the states, universities, cities, or so on. I think he's right. The problem is Quebec doesn't feel at ease in that scenario. We want to do the same thing in Quebec as a sovereign country, not superior, neither inferior, but just different, as countries are different, and it's important in our globalized world to exist and to have a great link of friendship with our neighbors.
Mr. Martin, in the 10,000 emails that we got from Canadians, we've saw a lot of gripes and anxiety and serious concerns about this country. But many of the Canadians who wrote us also talked about what they felt were Canada's various strengths. So I'd like to end with a follow-up asking you is what you see as the single greatest strength of Canada that will deliver your vision of 50 years from now.
Oh, our people. Overwhelmingly our people. I mean, you think about this country, linguistic duality, a tremendous value of this country, but a multicultural nation, people drawn from the four corners of the world. And take a look at the rest. Take a look what's happening in Europe and other countries, the lack of social cohesion, how they pull together. And yet we have done this. We are essentially, I believe, building an ever richer identity every year. And I think that those people, with those skills and that understanding, that's our greatest asset.
And Mr. Duceppe, you've lived in this country for a long time. What do you think is its great strength?
Well, even if I want a sovereign Quebec, I think I admire Canada and the Canadian as a great nation, a democratic nation, a country that is well respected in the world. And I think it's not because we're against Canada that we want Quebec to be sovereign. Just like Canadians are not against the United States, but they feel they're different. Simply that same thing for us.
Thank you. Mr. Harper?
Well, unfortunately, I have exactly the same answer as Mr. Martin. I think it's our people, it's the incredible diversity and yet social cohesion, and we see a lot of the potential out there that isn't being properly used. But if I could just go maybe to a different subject on this. You know, we watch our hockey team competing for gold medals and often winning. We probably wouldn't win if we had a Canada team and a Quebec team. And I just say to Mr. Duceppe and all the people of Quebec, I understand where they're coming from, but we would be both of us irreversibly diminished if this country were to be divided.
Mr. Layton.
Our greatest strength are the working people who build the country. They've been building it for decades, generations. It's been tough, hard work. They've done it for their families, but they've also done it for our country. We are a nation of builders, sometimes on a small scale, sometimes on a grand scale. We need to start building again. We've seen too much taking apart of the things that we've built. Our Medicare system slipping between our fingers. Our social programs in tatters, poverty increasing. We didn't want to build that kind of society.
Thank you so much.
Let's get back to building.
Thank you so much for your answers to the questions. And now we go to our final closing statements. And the first statement is to Mr. Paul Martin.
Well, thank you. Tonight, you have heard different visions of Canada, and you have a choice to make. I want to build on what we have accomplished together. Together we have made deficits a relic of the past. Together we have lowered unemployment to its lowest level not seen since the early 70s. Let's continue down this road. Let's build strong social programs. Let's create good jobs. Let's cut taxes so that working families can keep more money in their pockets. Now, Mr. Harper has a different idea of Canada. He would take us off this road. He would take us down another one. And so it matters who you choose to be Prime Minister and what that person believes. I stand for a Canada that refuses to borrow to pay its bills. I stand for a Canada that's guided by fairness, a country in which we work hard to achieve our national promise and that we do so together. On January 23rd, you will get a pencil and a ballot. You will stand alone. At that moment, you will choose the person who will be the Prime Minister of Canada and the person that we will follow. May I just say to you, thank you.
Mr.
Merry
Layton.
Christmas and happy holidays.
Mr. Layton.
Thank you for watching tonight. As I said at the beginning, tonight you heard a long list of expensive vote-buying promises from the Liberals and the Conservatives. But I ask you to think about the record of these parties over the last many years. Have they kept their promises? And who have they governed for? Was it for you and for your family? Or mostly for their well-connected friends? Isn't it time we changed politics? Isn't it time we elected MPs that will fight for young people, for seniors, for working families, for all of us, day in and day out? This election, you can do that. When you vote NDP, you help elect an NDP MP to clean up corruption and get results for people. We started that change in the last Parliament, and with your support, we'll do more. It's something to think about. In the meantime, I wish you a very happy Christmas for you and your families.
Mr. Duceppe.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, the Liberal government of Paul Martin must be sanctioned. As you know, there is a sponsorship scandal. But there are other reasons just as important. The Liberals must be sanctioned for refusing to recognize and correct the fiscal imbalance, for neglecting to increase spending for post-secondary education, for their inaction in the matter of unemployment insurance, for their culture of entitlement that continues despite Judge Gomery's severe judgment. For all these reasons, you must sanction the Liberal Party of Paul Martin. Remember that not one elected Liberal has been sanctioned. On January the 23rd, it will be up to you to sanction the Liberals. I invite all Quebecers, without exception, to vote for the Bloc Québécois. Thank you, and I wish you a Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays.
Mr. Harper.
Thank you. On January 23rd, Canadians face a clear choice. It's a choice between old and new, between scandals and accountability, between benefits for a favored few and honest government for everyone. A new Conservative government will get on with addressing the real priorities of ordinary working people and their families. We'll clean up government. The Liberals haven't. We'll cut the GST. The Liberals didn't. We'll crack down on crime. The Liberals can't. We'll provide choice in childcare. The Liberals won't. And we will protect the hard-earned assets of our seniors. The Liberals ignore. We have an immense land of unparalleled resources. We have people of ambition and energy drawn from all corners of the earth. Canada can have the wealthiest economy, the best social services, and the highest standards of democracy in the world. As Canadians, you should settle for nothing less. As Prime Minister, I will settle for nothing less on your behalf. On January 23rd, I ask you to stand up for Canada, elect a new Conservative government, and I also want to add to you and your family, Merry Christmas and Happy New Year.
Thank you all for attending this evening based on 10,000 questions. We hope you'll make a New Year's resolution to watch the next set of federal leaders' debates. Good night from Vancouver. We appreciated very much all those who sent in their questions. We wish all of you a very happy holidays. Merry Christmas. Good night.